Hi, I'm Jack Howell. Before you click away, as about 40% of you do almost immediately, if you are anxious or struggling emotionally, and if you're a young person, recent research says there's about a 65% chance that you are, at least, check out the links to Yale happiness expert Laurie Santos in the description. This video is actually about music, but music is mostly about how we think, so there's a connection. If you're in trouble, Dr. Santos seems to be making a difference. I always meant to make a video about how I like to use Baermann 3, but I had no real sense of urgency about it. After listening to a lecture that Dr. Santos gave a few days here ago in Pittsburgh at Heinz Hall, I felt differently. I'll explain shortly. First, listen to this bit of Robert Marcellus's 1982 master class.
Interesting, there were a couple of fellows from Phoenix, Arizona that were seniors in high school and came to audition for me in Cleveland. And I accepted them and they started their first year with me as freshmen. And they were sort of friendly competitors. They were very close friends, but sort of competitors too. And at the end of the first year of their study, I felt that they hadn't really gotten as far as I thought their promise indicated they would. And I was a little frustrated with my own teaching, because by the time they reached the last measure of Barreau's phrasing study, they were sort of gasping for air, and the reed would sound a little pinched and not quite the same as the first line. And so we parted company for the summer, and as I said, I felt a little frustrated. Maybe I didn't help them with reeds another, I don't know what. And they came back in the fall, and I must say they sounded tremendous improvement. And I was paranoid about it, and I said, all right, who did you see? But to make a long story short, they said, no, we went back to Phoenix, and we both hit ourselves against the wall, and we got up an hour earlier each day and practiced the third Baermann every day for a month. And it's amazing. The endurance that they had, the tone was better. So many problems that would send us scuffling trying to solve were solved because they felt much more at home on the instrument. Okay?
Right. Mitchell Lurie. Did you see Mitchell Lurie? You know, if anybody knows who those two Phoenix freshmen were, I'm very curious. So that recording is from Marcellus's 1982 master class. It was a bootleg recording. I think I got it in 1985. The whole thing is online, various places, including website The Curious Clarinetist, and I'll link that for you in the description. So I took that story very seriously, and what I am going to show you in a little bit is exactly how my teacher, Bil Jackson, a Marcellus student, told me that he practiced Baermann 3. So I did it too. And this was in Bill's early days as principal of the Denver Symphony, and while he was a ferocious sight reader, he was also playing a lot of big rep for the first time. And he was taking auditions, so he was practicing. He said that days when he didn't think he had time for a warm-up were exactly the days that he knew he needed to play a warm-up. And that's coming from one of the most abundantly gifted clarinetists I know. So consider that if you think Baermann 3 is boring or too elementary. And I'm not suggesting that Baermann 3 is all you should do, nor the only thing you should do, and what I will show you, that Bill showed me, is not the only way you can or should play it. There are many other resources for primary fundamental practice. Closet, Lazarus, Jean-Jean, Galper, Gettel. The list of possibilities is endless. And I'll make videos about some of them eventually, Galper for sure. But I've always encouraged all of my students to adopt the fundamental warm-up as an essential part of practice. And as soon as they are able, we turn to Baermann 3. Now, not every student has exactly the same reaction, but it seems to me that once students hit Baermann 3, and once they absorb the spirit of Bill's method, they tend to grab another gear. Like Marcellus's Arizona students, they get stronger, they play more easily, many problems solve themselves. Here's what I think is going on. And the working title for this video was going to be How to Spend an Hour a Day on Baermann 3, in the spirit of Robert Marcellus's story. However, like I said, I went to a lecture by Laurie Santos, and it occurred to me during that lecture that an equally, if not more important topic was why to spend an hour, or some portion thereof, on Baermann 3. Dr. Santos is a psychology professor who teaches a course at Yale called Psychology and the Good Life, that she designed to address the mental health crisis among college students. 65% of college students report overwhelming levels of anxiety, which is the highest level you can self-report. 10% of college students have considered suicide within the past year. Yikes! Yikes! There are other statistics, but those two ought to be heartbreaking enough. So Dr. Santos looked at her college, looked at her kids, and said, somebody's got to do something. Her class provides students with research-based tools to be happier, and it quickly became the most popular undergraduate course in the 300-year history of Yale University. There is an online version of her course that I will link in the description, and a version for teens. It is free. Now, the first point in Dr. Santos's lecture concerned performance. As performers, up our alley. While we often think of happiness as something that will come if we perform well, research says it's the other way around. When we are happier, we perform better. Actually, I was struck by how many of Dr. Santos's points aligned with Tomo Fujita's guitar wisdom, those rules for practice, self-compassion, for instance. There's a video I'll link in the description. Something else from the lecture that struck me was a statistical link between mind wandering and unhappiness. Certainly nowadays we hear plenty about staying present. CMU even has a mindfulness course that's part of the music curriculum. But I wasn't really thinking about it until this lecture mentioned some recent studies. I will link an article in the online Harvard Gazette that summarizes the research of Harvard psychologists Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert. No, not that Dan Gilbert. They designed an app to track whether or not people were actually thinking about what they were doing and whether or not they were happy. Turns out 46.9% of the time our minds are wandering, and most of the time this makes us unhappy. Daydreaming has a pleasant Calvin and Hobbes connotation, but most of the time when our minds wander, we wind up worrying. Mark Twain, writing toward the end of his life, said, "I am an old man. My life has been filled with 1,000 tragedies, the vast majority of which never happened." Most of us started clarinet because playing music made us happy. Well, either that or our parents forced us. If we go into music as a profession, it's not to get rich. It's because we are compelled. There is nothing like a great musical experience. Nothing. It's the best. Playing and practicing should make us happy. Nevertheless, my students often report feeling frustrated and anxious while practicing. They may feel that they aren't improving rapidly enough, or that they won't be ready for an upcoming performance or an audition. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that their minds are wandering. I'm going to go further out on that limb and say that most of us don't have enough practice time. If you're a conservatory student or a grad student, maybe you do, but if you're a music ed major, you don't. And even if you have enough time to practice, upcoming performances or auditions can create a feeling of urgency. And when practicing repertoire in anticipation of being judged, You know, our minds can wander. Let's say I'm practicing for an audition. I'm practicing, I'm playing Capriccio, I make a mistake. My mind starts racing. Oh no, what if I make that mistake in the audition? I won't get the job. I already have 3 auditions racking up finance charges on my credit card. My Starbucks schedule is killing me. How much longer can I do this? Or whatever. If you really can't think of your own practice panic scenario, you're in pretty rarefied air. The point is, if we are no longer present, we are now unhappy, statistically speaking, and if we are practicing unhappily, we have a problem on several levels. When you practice fundamentals, Baermann, for instance, it's not for an audition or a concert or a recital or anything else that's provoking worry. It's for you. It is your investment in yourself. You don't need to compare your Baermann to anyone else's Baermann. You can accept incremental progress. Therefore, your attention is more available to stay in the present. In the present, you can feel your breathing, your airstream focus. You can be assessing your level of hand tension, feeling the rhythm in your finger motion, feeling your tongue relax in order to articulate smoothly. You can be ingraining Bonnard's advanced finger staccato. I know I owe you guys a video on that. Preparing upcoming intervals in your hand position, like the recent video. You will, or should be, playing with real musical intention, savoring the musical vocabulary so that when you install it in repertoire, it's already beautiful. If you stay in the present, you're happier. Science says so. Being happier, you play better. Science says so. So as you practice, you can feel yourself becoming more fluid and connected to the instrument. And when you finish your warm-up and turn to your repertoire, you are a different musician than you would have been had you simply waded straight into the music you're already worried about. This is what Bil meant when he said that the days he didn't have time for a warm-up was when he needed it the most. So that's the spiel. Either I've gotten you interested in this idea of happiness in Baermann a la Bil, or you're long gone. So here we go. And speaking of staying present, it helps practicing if you turn your phone off. I think the effectiveness in Bil's approach to Baermann comes, in part, from adding specificity to an already very specific exercise. There is a difference between doing 100 push-ups any old way and doing 100 push-ups with perfect form. So we begin with number 1, the extended scales. Let's take an easy one. Let's say G major. The first step is to center the tone and establish a relaxed, sustainable articulation. To do that, we find our best tone, our dolce tone, on that low G, and we set the metronome to a tempo where we can play 4 measures in 4/4 of smooth, non-staccato, articulated 16th notes. This part of the exercise is not to try to tongue fast, necessarily, although if you have a fast tongue, by all means, go ahead. It is to make tone and articulation the same thing, to develop an effortless articulation that is powered by tone. As Russ Dagan said, tone and articulation are 2 sides of the same coin. 4 bars is just long enough to get fatigued if we're tense. By prolonging our articulation, we learn to position our tongue to avoid tension and thus fatigue and preserve the dolce tone. This also requires us to send our airstream through the articulations, like an arrow through sheets of paper. Very important, through, not to the articulation with the airstream. Now you do the same thing on the A. If you feel the tone becoming pinched or fuzzy or the pitch drops, play a long tone, maybe do that double tongue drill. Establish that you are indeed playing with your best tone and your articulation is not changing it. Remember, the dolce tone is your benchmark. Do the same thing on every scale degree, at least up to the second register left hand, into the altissimo if you want to be thorough. Doing this, you want to feel how the response of the instrument changes through the register, how articulation is somewhat resistant in the low register, how it becomes easier as you move up through the throat register, how it becomes more sensitive to tongue position as you go higher in the second register. If you find yourself struggling, take a slower tempo or relax. You're not striving to extend a tense, inefficient articulation another bar or two. You are searching for a smooth, efficient, beautiful articulation that you could play all day, which in the end should be faster. Most players, once they establish a good tongue position and contact point and relax, find 100 to 120 beats per minute pretty manageable. Now, there are some freaks out there. I've had students who effortlessly got into the 160s, and that genetics. Again, the quality is more important than the number, but if the articulation is slow and effortful, it's not vocal and beautiful, and the tone probably isn't great either. I already said it, I know, but if your tongue is moving a lot or dropping when you articulate, try the double tongue drill. Holy cow, you're thinking, I don't have time for that. Well, I just timed it a little bit ago. It takes 5 minutes. Next, play the scale at your established tempo slurred in eighth notes. Play exactly in rhythm, obey Robert Marcellus's 3-finger rules, and articulate and anticipate at least each note in your hand position, which is pretty easy in G major, all the more reason to do it perfectly. When you need a breath, play the first note of the next note solidly, take a full breath in tempo, then resume on that beat. Next, play the same scale, articulated, being careful to move your fingers as soon as your tongue touches the reed and stops the tone, not as the next note sounds. This is very important. Advancing your fingers ahead of your articulation is one of the main reasons to play the scale in eighths. I know, Banad video. So forth. Remember how when you played 4 bars of 16ths, your airstream stayed steady and went through the articulations like an arrow through sheets of paper? You want to feel and sound exactly like that. And if you feel yourself stopping the air to articulate, coordinating with your fingers, this is where you fight that battle. Now, play the same scale in triplets, slurred and articulated. So forth. Now, maintain the same sense of rhythm in your hands as when slurring as you did in the duples. Maintain the same sense of steady air and advance finger staccato when articulated. Now, slurred and articulated in 16ths. so forth. Now, if you have a naturally fast, clean articulation, but you haven't practiced fundamentals much, you may find that this tempo is too fast for your fingers, or you haven't quite got the knack of coordinating fingers and tongue. I know, but not video. In which case, you have to decide what to do. You could just slow down, or you could not play 16ths until you can play all the scales perfectly and have gone through the whole cycle a few times with the eighths and the triplets. If you establish perfect mechanics and learn the patterns, you may find that the finger speed was already there. To develop speed, practice ease, not effort. Going from one subdivision to the next should feel like changing gears in a car, not like pushing the accelerator. Okay? Now do the same thing with relative minor. The goal is to play a different major relative minor pair each day. Done straight through. Up to this point, we're at about 10 minutes. Now turn to the scales in thirds, number 8, and do exactly the same thing. Eighths, triplets, 16ths, slurred and articulated, relative major and relative minor. Now the whole thing up to this point takes maybe 20 minutes at a quarter equals 100. And that may be all for you. It's honestly hard for music ed majors who have an extremely full, time-consuming curriculum to find more than an hour a day to practice. And they'll have to alternate Baermann with other things to cover the necessary ground and graduate ready to teach. But I ask for, if nothing else, at least the scales and the scales in thirds. If you have 2 hours a day to practice and need to prepare for an audition or practice, maybe an hour of Baermann seems like an unaffordable luxury. Okay, combine 20 minutes of Baermann with a Moyes tone study and a Kell staccato study, or with Jean-Jean's left-hand vade-mecum and a Rose phrasing etude. There you've done a solid half hour of warm-up that will make your audition prep that much better. Really think hard if you feel that you have too much repertoire to learn to practice fundamentals. Many of the musicians I admire most say that they spend the majority of their practice time on fundamentals rather than repertoire. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So let's say you're committed and buckled up for an hour of Baermann. What next? Well, it depends. Assess your own strengths and weaknesses. What do you need most? The exercise in sixths, number 9, I think those are super valuable. When I play them at a tempo where I can concentrate on singing intervals and minimizing tongue movement. In fact, this is the exercise that helped me eliminate tongue motion when I was studying with Bill. So they're especially therapeutic for players like that, and for players working to stabilize the embouchure and eliminate changing registers by biting. The returning and interrupted scales are excellent. Maybe you want to practice them slurred for speed. The various arpeggio studies are staples, particularly if you use them to listen for intonation in the throat register. It wouldn't be a terrible idea to play them slowly with a drone on the tonic. There's nothing flatter than a flat clarinet in the throat register, and if you don't hear it in these exercises, you won't hear it in the Beethoven 8 minuet either. You may select and adapt any exercise to work on articulation speed, work on mixed articulations. Let's say you've got a difficult passage in A major and you really want to burn A major into your fingers. You can go through the book and play every exercise on A major. There are very many things to work on. Everyone has different strengths and weaknesses, and your warm-up will change over time. Music is an iterative process. We perform, evaluate, strategize, work, repeat. As I said earlier, Baermann is not the only resource. However, I think as a teacher I can report a significant correlation between students taking the first part of their practice and calmly, methodically centering their tone, their technique, and their thoughts, and students improving. Maybe it's not that simple. A fundamental warm-up making you a happier practicer and thus a happier person. Nothing's ever really simple, but it's a start. And if you don't already practice like this, give it a shot. As the punchline to the old joke goes, it can't wait. If you liked this video, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. All hail the algorithm. And if you're interested in music at Duquesne University or Carnegie Mellon University, you can contact me by going to duq.edu or cmu.edu and searching on my name. Go get 'em.